Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the St. Louis Podcast. As always, my name is Eric Brown. I'm the host here. I'm also the CEO at Vi Media and partner in another couple companies as well. Today, we have something I wanted to explore. I watched a video about this a couple days ago, and I think, and I could be wrong, that the majority of us do not know our debt, do not know how much the U.S. spends on a yearly basis, what our revenue is, where that money is going to, and essentially the massive hole we continue to dig ourselves in. But before we talk about that, I wanted to rant for a second because getting together a group of guys to go out of town is an absolute nightmare. Okay? We're going to California here, recording this Tuesday, November 4th, leaving tomorrow. Of course, this will come out on Friday. And we originally had 7 people confirmed. 6 had flights and paid for their room. And we're down to 4. And of course, as always, as it goes with men, not much of a heads up. And therefore, you can't really reach out to people, a week before you head out to California unless they, have some sort of job that allows them the flexibility to do so. So with that said, sound off in the comments. Why is it so hard to get a group of men together to go out of town, everyone follow through and do what they say they're going to do? Why is this so difficult? Of course, we're going to, last year, we talked about this on the podcast. I, drove pretty much all of the one. Actually, I did drive essentially all of the one from San Diego up to the border of. Well, actually, we went into Oregon. So, I've done a lot of the one. And last year we stopped at Sonoma County for like 2 days, and that is where 4 gentlemen are going to go to drink some wine here Wednesday. And I'm excited. Of course, if you know me personally, my dad owned a wine, liquor and deli for a long time, super long time, Kerr's Mill and Clayton there, Claymont Wine and Spirits, Corner Deli. So, I've always been into wine, due to my family. So I'm excited to go out there. I know for a fact that I know way more about wine than the other gentleman going. So I'm excited for this trip regardless if it went from 7 to 4. It does logistically, though, make it a little bit easier to go into restaurants and things like that when you could get a table of 4 instead of a table of, 7. Good luck trying to have them figure that out at a restaurant when they're busy. So with that said, supposed to be pretty nice weather. I'm excited. I got some new mics, DJI mic Mini 3 or Pro 3, something like that. I'm gonna record next week's episode out there in California somewhere. Might be a couple random guests. Might just be myself on the beach talking. Who knows? Going out there. Then I'm flying down to Irvine. My cousin just started school there. And there's an event in Irvine as well that I can attend. So perfect timing. Go do some business and I get to hang out with my cousin in Irvine. Never seen the campus. So I'm excited for that. So we got some cool stuff coming up for me personally. And of course, as I'm talking about traveling and spending money today, I want to talk about the current state of the U.S. debt, which is an interesting topic, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to be put to sleep, but I will say that I'm going to try and make this as interesting as possible, and also this is super important because I don't know what happens if we continue to go down this hole. And I'll kind of talk about some things. And again, I'm not an economist. I have a degree of health science from Mizzou, and essentially I've been in marketing and a business owner ever since. But from a standpoint of business, if you just look at revenue coming in versus what you're spending, obviously, you need the revenue to be higher than your spend, unless, of course, you're OpenAI or any of these other companies that are absolutely bleeding money. I think OpenAI lost $11.5 billion. I don't know if that was so far this year or last year. I forgot where I was reading that, but regardless. So let's talk about this. So the U.S. national debt has accelerated beyond previous estimates, hitting record highs amid post-pandemic recovery, inflation, and policy decisions. As of October 23rd, 2025, the total gross federal debt surpassed $38 trillion for the first time, of course. We just continue going up, marking the fastest $1 trillion accumulation outside of pandemic years. This is up from $37.6 trillion at the end of September 2025. So we're just absolutely spending money like crazy right now, reflecting daily increases of around $69,000 per second, or $2.2 trillion per year, year over year. Okay, so we're over 38 trillion in debt. And again, it's increasing $69,000 per second. Approximately 30 trillion, about 80% total, which excludes government holdings like Social Security and trust funds. This public portion is what markets focus on as it's financed by investors. So you heard that right. 30 trillion is the debt held by the public. The gross debt stands, of course, we got a debt to GDP ratio. Gross debt stands at 123% of GDP, while debt held by the public is essentially 100%. Historically, this ratio is 35% in 1980, 64% in 2000, and 100% pre-COVID. Projections show a climbing to over 102% by September of next year. We added $2 trillion in debt, fueled by $1.8 trillion deficit, plus adjustments for delayed borrowing during debt ceiling negotiations. The debt has grown sevenfold in the last 25 years. There was a total debt of $5.7 trillion in the year 2000. Okay. So that means that the debt per capita, so per person, is $113,000 per person, up from $100,000 just 1 year ago. So this is like owing $1.1 million on a $100,000 home. I'll say that again. This is like owing $1 million on a $100,000 income. Excuse me, not home. So if you make $100,000, go look at house prices mortgage calculator. Obviously, you're not affording a $1.1 million house. U.S. gross debt to GDP is below Japan's 250%. As we know, they've been in like massive inflation over there. But it is significantly above Germany's 60% or China's 80%. However, because we still have reserve currency status, and I say still because, of course, people all the time talk about how we may lose reserve currency status. And again, all I know is that's not good for the U.S. dollar. Because, of course, I believe what that means is you can back, essentially, your country's dollars to that. The debt limit was raised by $5 trillion to $41.1 trillion in July 2025 via budget reconciliation, averting a crisis but highlighting recurring brinkmanship. Congress has raised it 78 times since 1960. 78 times since 1960. That's more than once per year. More than once per year. So the two things that I want everyone to get out of this is this. Right now, we are in a budget deficit of $1.8 trillion this year. That means we are overspending compared to the tax revenue that we get, the U.S. gets on a yearly basis. We are spending $1.8 trillion over that. What that means? Debt. and we get a loan for it. And what is the loan? If anybody knows anything about a loan, what do you do on that? You make interest payments. And we'll get to that here in a second on why that's such a huge issue. Okay, so if we're looking at spend, right, the 2025 deficit was confirmed at $1.8 trillion or $1.78 trillion after minor adjustments. Now, last year was actually more at $1.83 trillion. So, right, I said we are overspending by $1.8 trillion. Right now, the percent of total spending, $1.47 trillion goes to Social Security. That is 21%. If we get rid of Social Security entirely, we're still in a deficit. Think about that. Medicare and Medicaid, $1.62 trillion. That's 23% of total spending. If we get rid of Medicare and Medicaid entirely, we're still overspending. Defense spending was $910 billion, 13% of total spend. Veterans SNAP, food assistance, and other mandatory contributions, little bit over $1 trillion. That's 15%. Now, here's what I wanted to talk about. Our net interest payment on a yearly basis is 14% of our entire tax basis. We are spending almost $1 trillion on net interest. That is 15% of the entire taxes on an annual basis. Now, total revenue, right? We need to know this. So the total spend, $7 trillion. Now, we're only bringing in $5.21 trillion, which is $5.2 trillion. Individual taxes, individual income taxes make up 50% of all revenue of the national government at $2.6 trillion. Payroll taxes, $1.6 trillion, 31%. Corporate taxes. Now, this is interesting. Only $500 billion. 10%. Listen, I'm not going to continue to sit on this podcast and say the people at the top need to pay their fair share, but it's obviously that they're not. Because we know that these guys, Elon Musk and these guys, aren't paying much in income tax. Let's just see. Let's just take a look here. Sometimes amounting to zero in federal income tax in specific years. Bezos paid zero from 2007 to 2011. Between 2006 and 2018, his wealth grew to an estimated 127 billion. He reported $6.5 billion in income, and he paid $1.4 billion in personal federal taxes. True tax rate of about 1% on his total wealth growth during that period. That's crazy. We know how much we pay. How much of your paycheck is taken out on a monthly basis to pay? And none of this fixes the problem that we don't, right now, we're not bringing in enough tax revenue to spend the amount of money that we're spending. So where does this leave us? This leaves us with federal government right now that is shut down, that no one can agree upon. Also, other excise, tariffs, estate taxes, things like that brings it to about $500 billion. It's about 10% of total tax. So for every dollar that we bring in, we spend $1.34, equivalent to a family earning $100,000 but spending $134,000 a year. Now, of course, we can debate overspending versus undertaxing. But personally, and I think we all feel the same way, like if you're making under, let's just say quarter of a mil, quarter of a million, $500,000 a year, somewhere in that range, then you can start, taxing them a little bit heavier. But it doesn't make sense for the people that are making 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, $80,000 a year, to have to pay 30, 40% of what they make to taxes. It's insane. And considering that obviously our taxes are not going to areas that we agree are best suited to, best fit the U.S., right? And we spend so much money, and we just went over that, in, Medicaid and Medicare, in Social Security, and all of these different systems. We obviously need these systems, because I think it's heartless to go out here and say, there's a lot of people on social media saying, I don't care about SNAP recipients, go get a job. It's like, and I didn't grow up poor in a bad household or anything like that, but I think if you grew up in that type of environment, you'd be thinking way differently. Sure, there are people that abuse the system, that can work, that get food stamps, that abuse the system. Obviously, that's a thing. We're all aware. That's one thing I think we all wish wasn't a thing. Because maybe if we got rid of all the bloat and bullshit, we wouldn't have to bring in additional revenue. Or instead of figuring out how to bring in additional revenue through personal income tax, we know that, these guys worth over $1 trillion combined in the U.S. don't pay their fair share. And that's apparent. Very apparent. Let's just look at Apple profit 2024. Apple's profit in 2024 was almost $100 billion. Now let's see how much they pay in taxes. 30 bill. 24.1%. Okay, so it says that much of Apple's money is earned, stored for a period of time, spent overseas, and not subject to U.S. corporate income tax. Apple's one of the largest corporate owners of U.S. Treasuries. They hold $50 billion in short-term and long-term U.S. Treasuries. Now, this was a year ago. U.S. Treasuries offer some tax advantages as interest payments aren't normally taxed on a state and local level. Interesting. All right, so we have an imbalance. Tariffs hit a record 120 billion in 2025, but they don't offset deficits and may rise consumer prices. Yeah, you're just literally killing the little man on this. You're bringing in tariffs, and I think we can pretty much all agree that all tariffs have done is increase the price of goods on most things and products and things to make those products. So how do we get here? The debt's growth stems from wars, crimes, tax policies, demographics, and key inflection points. So let's talk about it. Debt started at $75 million from the Revolutionary War. Now, this was between the years of 1776 and 1860. It peaked at $127 million post 1812 war, then fell to zero in 1835 under Jackson. Now, of course, then we had the Civil War. This is from 1861 to 1916. The Civil War ballooned debt from $65 million to $2.8 billion, 4,000% rise. World War I added $25 billion. 1930s to 1940s, Great Depression, World War II pushed debt from $16 billion at the beginning of 1930 to over $269 billion in 1946. That was 106% of the GDP. Reagan tax cuts and military buildup tripled debt during Reagan to $2.8 trillion. Deficits averaged $200 billion a year. 1990s, Clinton-era surpluses, $236 billion in 2000. From boom tax hikes, reduced debt to GDP to 55%. And like we said earlier, we're over 100%, right? Japan's at 250%. Germany was at 60% still. Obviously, then in 2000s, we had the Bush tax cuts, $1.5 trillion cost, 9/11 wars, over $2 trillion. The 2008 crisis, of course, where essentially all of us, the citizens, paid $700 billion through TARP, and it doubled the debt to $10 trillion. Right? We bailed out the banks. Obama stimulus, $800 billion. Obviously, we had the ACA. Trump tax cuts as well, $1.9 trillion cost. Then we hit $23 trillion. Debt to GDP to 105%. Obviously, 2020s, we had COVID. $6 trillion, jumped debt to $38 trillion. Demographics add $500 billion a year in entitlements. So we keep going up. And like I said, interest payments right now are 15% of our total revenue on a yearly basis. If a business were to be doing that, they'd be out of business. They'd be out of business and they'd owe a lot of money. I don't think the U.S. can declare bankruptcy. So what does this mean for the population? High debt crowds out growth, with estimates showing each 1% rise in debt to GDP reduces annual GDP by 0.1%, potentially lowering wages 5 to 10% over decades. $113,000 per person shares, burdening future generations with $14 trillion in interest over 10 years. That's insane. We just keep kicking the can down the road and hoping that the next younger generation will figure it out. I don't understand this. Get these old heads out of politics. Get them out. You're over 70, you're done. You're over 65, you're done. You can go be a mentor or whatever, but we don't need your great-grandparents running this country. It's obviously not working. With everything I continue to talk about on this podcast, I don't see, obviously we could have a discussion about it, right? There are good things. But I don't foresee stuff getting better for us. Anyone listening to this podcast. Now, of course, unless you're, a billionaire, maybe it's a little bit different story. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you don't, chances are you don't. Right now, it's harder for millennials. It's only going to get harder for Gen Z, for Alpha generation, and continuing on down the road. We talked about how the younger generation aren't getting jobs, can't afford homes. Where does this lead us? Does anyone care? Does anyone care? Honest question. And then, of course, you talk about this with people in person, and the question is, what do we do? I don't know. I sit here and talk about it on the podcast that way. The listeners to this can hopefully realize what we're working with, and then they can spread the news. And I wanted to talk about this actually because I watched, and I'll give a shout out to the guy I watched it on. I think it's Clear Avoidance Tax. Where is this at? Clear Value Tax. If you go to YouTube, Clear Value Tax, go to America's 38 trillion debt crisis. It was released Monday, November 3rd, it looks like. And we continue every single year to spend more and more. Bush increased it. Obama increased it even more. Trump increased it even more. Biden increased it even more than Trump. And now Trump is potentially going to increase it even more than Biden over the same amount of time. But my point is, what is the end goal for the people of the U.S.? All of us. I read some interesting things. I'm like, they're trying to cause hyperinflation. Because with all these interest payments, of course, what the Fed wants to do is bring down interest rates, right? That way they don't have to pay as much on the debt. But if we lower interest rates more and more, we're going to cause more inflation. And they're talking about quantitative easing and, essentially turning back on the printing press next year. We don't know when. So it's almost like we just need to invest in inflation assets at this point. But we're all just going to go buy gold bars from Costco and silver. Hopefully, Bitcoin isn't some sort of grift, which I definitely think it is, but I don't know. I got a little bit of money in there, but it's by no means am I betting that, that's going to do something. I'm just not a trustworthy person when it comes to crypto. A lot of people that I know have made a lot of money off of it. Let me tell you, every time they bring it up, I get jealous. But the simple fact is, I like to put my money in things that at least I somewhat know is backed on something. And it really doesn't even seem to be inflation proof. Stock market goes down, Bitcoin goes down. And we've talked about this actually on the podcast, I believe at the beginning of this year as well. We talk about so many things on this podcast. Just essentially it's my ADD podcast when I'm just sitting here by myself. Because I'm like, I found this interesting. I think more people need to know about this because it's detrimentally affecting absolutely every single person that listens to this podcast. 100%, no doubt about it. So obviously we have higher rates. Mortgages are up 1% to 2%. It reduces investment. We have stagnant wages. Our wages are actually down 2% since 2020. Obviously we're cutting social programs. We have a crisis if yields spike. And we continue to pay more and more in interest as we continue to take out more and more in debt. Interest is now bigger than kids' education budget nationwide. Interest is now bigger than kids' education budget nationwide. That's insane. Budget grows under both parties, right? It's not a Republican and Democratic thing. Future projections. We could have our deficit rise to over $2 trillion by 2030 per year. Debt held by the public could reach $40 trillion by 2028 and $45 trillion by 2030, pushing debt to GDP to 110%. If interest rates average 4%, annual interest rate could hit $1.5 trillion by 2030. Long-term, 2035 to 2055, right? Let's talk about that. By 2035, debt could climb to $52 trillion, 118% of GDP, the highest in history. Over 30 years, debt to GDP might reach 156% by 2055, driven by Social Security and Medicare costs rising to 12% of GDP related, compared to 8% today. So, call it a 50% increase. In a high rate environment, over 5%, debt could balloon to over 20% with reforms that could stabilize at 100% GDP by 2035. But if I'm a guesser, it's going to be the latter. We're going to go ahead and continue to climb in debt. Of course, what are the solutions, right? And I'm no smart person. So here are just some of my ideas. Idea number one, get money out of politics. That's obvious. All right, revenue. Raise taxes on high earners. I already said this. Top rate to 40%. That'll add $2 trillion per decade. So that doesn't even solve the problem. Implement 1% VAT tax on over $1 trillion in revenue. Close loopholes like carried interest. That's another $200 billion. The CBO actually lists 76 options, including carbon taxes at $1 trillion. Bailout or asset sales, selling federal lands could provide short-term relief. Let's not do that. Spending cuts, reform entitlements, raise Social Security age to 69. That will only save us $500 billion a year. As we know, we're overspending by $1.8 trillion, so that doesn't get us there. Cap Medicare growth, that'll save us $1 trillion. Even if we do both of those things, that's $1.5 trillion. Trim defense spending by $100 billion a year. Okay, now we're at $1.6 billion. Eliminate subsidies to the farm and energy. Probably not a good idea for our farmers. That's only $50 billion. Overall, $7.8 trillion in cuts needs to stabilize debt at 100% GDP by 2035. Is this scaring you yet? Did you know how bad it was? Honestly. If I ran the podcast or via media or any of the companies that I'm a partner in and own, or if you run your household, or if you run whatever, if you run your household, if you run your business like this, like the government does, you're out of business. You're foreclosed. You're homeless, right? Doesn't exist. You can't do it. The U.S. debt is high, but it's not an outlier. Global debt hit $251 trillion in 2025. That's 235% of world GDP, with public debt at $100 trillion. U.S. gross debt to GDP, like I said, about 120%. Public is about 100%. And is more comparable internationally. Global average is at 95%. That's up 2.5% from 2024. So global debt is obviously raising as well. Japan leads at 250% GDP, Italy 140%, Greece 160%, China 80%, Germany 60%. And obviously we're at, 100%. Now, U.S. benefits from dollar reserve status, borrowing at lower rates. Like I said, 3.36% for us versus over 5% for others. Now, obviously, if we lost that status, we'd be paying over 5%. And I believe our interest would essentially double. 25% of the U.S. debt, over $9 trillion, is held abroad as of June 2025. Top holders, Japan, $1.1 trillion. UK, $800 billion, China, $750 billion. This finances deficits but risks if holders sell. And obviously, like I said, debt is a bipartisan issue. It grows under both parties. $10 trillion each under recent admins. Obviously, it's been nothing but politicized via the shutdowns and the ceilings. As of this month, the mid-shutdown threats, debt hit $38 trillion, right? We already talked about that. Republicans emphasize spending cuts, Democrats revenue hikes. These people are on the same page, like I just talked about. They spend more no matter what. This is all bullshit. They think we're stupid. Trump admin claims policies slow spending, but deficits persist. You just look at how much is spent by president. It's literally on a graph. It's on I believe the Treasury website. And all of this is on the Treasury website. 2025 or 2024, 2025 cycles ignore debt. Future Congresses face over $2 trillion in deficits without action. Shutdowns delay decisions, and it just continues to add cost. So the longer we're shut down, it makes things worse. It does not make things better. Shutdowns hide the crisis. Congress raised ceilings 78 times, but brinkmanship risks downgrade. Common miss. Debt must be paid off. No, it's rolled over. U.S. hasn't defaulted since 1790. Focus on debt to GDP is not absolute. Regardless, we shouldn't be spending more than we bring in. Debt is harmless in own currency. Nope, wrong. It risks inflation. Low rates don't mean ignore. Debt always hurts the economy. That's also not necessarily true. But current levels are high and, they're burdensome. U.S. will default soon. It's unlikely. But debt limit is statutory, adjustable. Ignore reserve currency perks, like I said. Myth number 5, deficits, debt, same as over-leveraged economy. The U.S. net worth is positive. Debt finances assets. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. Next week is going to be a lot more chill. I'm going to be in California, soaking up the sun, having a good time, not worrying. Actually, you know what? Let's be honest. 4 dudes getting together, we're going to talk about this stuff, especially my group of friends, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. What are we supposed to do? Talk about the weather and sports all day? No, I'm good. We will. But that's not going to be it. All right. We got a little bit of a shorter episode for you guys here this week. Please like, review, subscribe, leave a comment. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear what you have to say about what we talked about. As always, you can reach out to us here. If you have a guest that you want to come on, if you have any thoughts, please send it over to us. You can go to our website, saythospodcast.com. You can reach out to us there. You can send us a message on any of the social media platforms. And of course, as always, show some love here to the guys at Half Coast Studios, based here in St. Louis in Creve Coeur. They can take care of recording. They can take care of editing. They can take care of distribution. They can take care of posting on social media. So, and if you just need one or a few of those things, they can tailor it to what you need. So reach out to them at halfcoaststudios.com. Of course, if you're hot, if you're cold, if you have rooms that are different temperatures, if your heating or AC bill is high, it could be due to the fact that you don't have good insulation in your home, or it's old, or you don't have enough. Please reach out to them at westcountyinsulation.com. And as always, Vi Media, the best damn marketing company on the planet. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.